You have lived your entire life assuming that one day, inevitably, it will end. But what if it never does? What if in some strange and terrifying way you are already immortal? If this is true, then you have already died countless times, but you never noticed. But how? To know about it in detail, let's start today's documentary on quantum immortality. Let's start with one of the most fundamental principles of quantum mechanics, and that is superposition. Unlike the objects we see in daily life, chairs, cars and people, quantum particles don't follow the same rules. They exist in a superposition of multiple states simultaneously. For instance, a photon can travel two paths at the same time, or an electron can be in multiple locations at once. But the moment we observe a particle, it chooses one state and collapses into a single reality. It's as if reality only exists once we look at it. Before that, it's just a sea of possibilities, uncertain, undefined. And if this is true for particles, what does it mean for the bigger things made of those particles? Like humans? Like you? Could your life itself be a superposition of multiple possibilities? Could there be versions of you that have already died, but you'll never experience those realities because your consciousness only follows the path where you survive? Before we answer that, let's look at one of the most famous quantum thought experiments of all time. In 1935, physicist Erwin Schrödinger posed a question so strange, so unsettling, that it still sparks debate nearly a century later. Imagine this. You take a cat and place it inside a sealed box. Inside the box, there is a small amount of radioactive material, which has a 50% chance of decaying within the next hour. A Geiger counter that detects radiation. A vial of poison that will be released if radiation is detected. The rules are simple. If the radioactive material decays, the poison is released and the cat dies. If the radioactive material does not decay, the cat stays alive. Now the question is, until someone opens the box and looks inside, the cat is neither fully dead nor fully alive. Instead, it exists in a quantum superposition, both dead and alive at the same time. The moment we observe it, reality snaps into place, forcing the cat into one definite state, dead or alive. This is called wave function collapse, when observation forces the universe to decide on one outcome. But what if reality doesn't just collapse into one outcome? What if both versions of the cat continue to exist, but in different universes? And what if, instead of a cat, you were the one in the box? What if, at the moment of death, your consciousness only continues in the version of reality where you survive? This is where quantum immortality enters the picture. According to this idea, just like Schrödinger's cat, your fate might also be a quantum superposition until it is observed. Right now, you might be living in the reality where you survived a car crash, where you avoided a deadly accident, or where you recovered from an illness that should have been fatal. But could there be other versions of you, ones that didn't survive? If the universe splits every time a quantum event occurs, then somewhere in some reality you have already died. Yet you'll never experience those realities because your consciousness only follows the path where you remain alive. If alternate versions of you exist, what happens when one of them dies? What happens to the you that is left behind? To understand this, we need to look at one of the most controversial and mind-bending theories in all of physics. The many worlds interpretation, the idea that reality itself is constantly branching into infinite parallel universes. Let's explore this idea. Imagine standing at a crossroads. Two paths stretch before you. One leads left and the other right. You hesitate for a moment, then make your choice. But what if reality didn't just follow the path you chose? What if, instead, the universe split in two, one version where you went left and another where you went right? And what if this branching of reality wasn't limited to big decisions but happened every single moment down to the smallest atomic event? This is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And if it's true, then right now there are countless versions of you living out different lives, making different choices, some thriving and some that have already died. In 1957, a young physicist named Hugh Everett III proposed a theory so radical, so unsettling, that most of the scientific community rejected it outright. Everett suggested that every time a quantum event occurs, the universe splits into multiple versions, each containing a different outcome. He called this the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Unlike traditional quantum mechanics, where a particle exists in a superposition of states until it is observed collapsing into one definite outcome, Everett's theory says all possible outcomes happen. Reality doesn't pick just one path, it follows all paths. In one universe, Schrödinger's cat is alive. In another, it is dead. Both universes are equally real. The only difference is you only experience one of them. But if infinite realities exist, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. What happens to the versions of you that don't survive? Every choice you make, every event that unfolds creates a branching effect. Some choices are small, like in one universe you miss the bus by a few seconds. In another, you catch it just in time. Some are life-changing. In one reality, you get a job offer that changes your career. In another, you never even apply. And some are life or death. In one universe, a car swerves toward you, but you jump away at the last moment. In another, you don't move fast enough. For you, only the surviving version matters, because that's the only one your consciousness continues to experience. The version of you that didn't make it, that universe still exists, but you are no longer there to perceive it. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, then every time you are faced with a life-threatening event, there exists at least one universe where you survive. From your own point of view, you will always continue to exist, even if, from an outside perspective, you should have died. Think about that for a moment. This means that right now, in an alternate reality, another version of you didn't survive a near-death event. Maybe they took a wrong turn. Maybe they got unlucky, maybe they blinked at the wrong moment. But you will never experience those realities. Your consciousness will only ever follow the path where you are still alive. This is the unsettling idea behind quantum immortality. The thought that you are continuously shifting between realities, always landing in the one where you keep surviving. But if that's true, why don't we notice these shifts? Why don't we remember dying in another reality before waking up in this one? To answer that, we need to talk about something called quantum decoherence. The reason why we don't see the multiverse even if we are constantly moving through it. If infinite versions of you exist, why don't you notice when you move between them? Now let's dive into that topic. You wake up in your bed, feeling perfectly normal, but as you step outside, something feels off. A street that you're sure had a coffee shop yesterday now has a bookstore. A friend recalls a conversation you don't remember having. A news headline reports an event you swear happened differently. Could it be just a bad memory? A coincidence? Or something much, much bigger? If the many worlds interpretation is correct, if we're constantly shifting between different versions of reality, then why don't we remember those transitions? Why don't we wake up every day noticing the differences? The answer lies in a concept called quantum decoherence. To understand why we don't see alternate universes, let's go back to Schrödinger's cat experiment. Inside the box, the cat is both dead and alive until the box is opened. When someone observes the cat, reality chooses one state, but according to the many worlds interpretation, both outcomes happen, one in each parallel universe. So why do we never see both versions of reality overlapping? The reason is quantum decoherence. This is the process that prevents quantum effects like superposition from occurring at large macroscopic scales. Quantum superposition, the ability for particles to be in multiple states at once, only works on the smallest scales. At the level of atoms and subatomic particles, things can remain in this state of multiple possibilities. But in the macroscopic world, the world we experience, superposition collapses almost instantly. Here are the reasons why. 1. Particles constantly interact with their surroundings. At the quantum level, particles behave in bizarre, unpredictable ways. But as soon as they interact with other particles, air molecules, photons, even heat, their state collapses into one definite outcome. 2. The more complex the system, the faster decoherence happens. A single electron can exist in superposition for longer. A human brain with trillions of interconnected particles, almost instantly. 3. The universe is built to filter out other realities. Every time the universe splits into multiple versions, each version becomes its own separate, self-contained reality. They don't overlap, don't interfere, and can't communicate with each other. In other words, even if you do transition into a different universe every time you should have died, you will never notice. To you, everything will feel perfectly normal. Think back on your life. Have you ever experienced an unbelievable near miss? A moment where you should have been seriously hurt, or worse, but somehow weren't? Have you ever woken up from a terrifying accident, completely unharmed, with no logical explanation for how you survived? Some believe that these moments, the times when you should have died but didn't, are evidence of quantum immortality in action. That in another reality, another version of you didn't make it. But your consciousness, the part of you that observes, experiences, and exists, shifted into the timeline where you survived. To you, it just felt like another normal day, because decoherence erased any memory of the other outcome. Some people believe that quantum decoherence could explain the Mandela Effect, the phenomenon where large groups of people remember events differently than they are recorded. What if these are remnants of previous realities? What if these are tiny fractures in our memory from shifting universes? Of course, many scientists dismiss this as a simple false memory, but the deeper question remains, if alternate versions of you exist, how many times have you already shifted without realizing? And if you're always surviving in some universe, could this mean that you are immortal? That question brings us to the next chapter, where we explore quantum suicide, the terrifying thought experiment that tests whether death itself is just an illusion. Like, if you can never perceive your own death, does that mean you will never truly die? Imagine standing in front of a machine, a device unlike anything ever built. It looks simple, a gun, a trigger, and a mechanism controlled by the laws of quantum mechanics. Here's how it works. Every time you pull the trigger, a quantum event occurs. In one universe, the event triggers the gun, and it fires. You die. In another universe, the event fails, the gun jams, and you survive. Now imagine you do this over and over again. To the outside world, your experiment seems reckless. Eventually, the probability will catch up to you and you will be gone. But from your own perspective, something truly bizarre happens. No matter how many times you pull the trigger, you only ever find yourself in the universes where the gun never fires. From your point of view, you are immortal. This is quantum suicide, a chilling thought experiment proposed by physicist Max Tegmark to test whether the many worlds interpretation is real. And if it is, if this experiment truly works, then it suggests something extraordinary. You will never experience your own death. Max Tegmark, a Swedish-American physicist, designed this experiment to prove or disprove one of the most mind-bending ideas in quantum mechanics, that every possible outcome of an event happens in some universe. Tegmark wanted to answer a terrifying question: if the many worlds interpretation is correct, do you always continue to exist in at least one universe, no matter what? And if that's true, does it mean that you are functionally immortal from your own perspective? The only way to test this theory, a deadly experiment, one that no rational person would ever attempt. The setup is brutally simple. A scientist sits in a chair facing a machine that fires a bullet at his head. But the gun isn't triggered by a simple pull of the trigger. Instead, it's connected to a quantum event, something completely random and unpredictable at a subatomic level. For example, it could be linked to the decay of a radioactive atom, which happens randomly, the spin of a quantum particle, which can be up or down with equal probability. Every time the experiment runs, the quantum event determines the outcome. In 50% of universes, the gun fires and the scientist dies. In the other 50% of universes, the gun misfires and the scientist survives. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, then from the scientist's own perspective, he never experiences death. Instead, his consciousness always continues in the realities where the gun doesn't go off. To him, it feels like the gun always jams. He might run the experiment 100 times, 1,000 times, forever, and never witness his own death. If this experiment works, it suggests something shocking. Death is not something you ever experience. Your consciousness always shifts into the realities where you survive. You will always wake up alive, no matter what. But here's where things get disturbing. If quantum immortality is real, it doesn't mean you are safe. It doesn't mean you will never suffer. It only means that from your perspective, you will never reach an end. Think about that for a moment. Even if the rest of the world sees you die, your awareness will always continue somewhere. Somewhere in the vast multiverse, you will keep waking up again and again, even when you shouldn't. And if that's true, then we must ask, has this already happened to you? Have you already died countless times, only to shift into a universe where you survived? To answer that, we need to go deeper into the nature of observation. Because if quantum immortality is real, then it means something even more unsettling. If you can never perceive your own death, does that mean you will never truly die? Let's explore that in detail. Imagine sitting in front of the quantum-triggered gun, heart pounding, knowing that in one reality, this moment is your last. But in another, you will simply continue, unharmed. You take a deep breath and pull the trigger. From an outsider's perspective, this is a reckless act of self-destruction, one that eventually will catch up with you. Statistically, the more times you perform this experiment, the more likely it is that the bullet will fire. The people watching from the outside world would expect you to be gone within a few rounds. And yet, from your own point of view, something different happens. Every time you pull the trigger, the gun always misfires. The experiment repeats over and over, and yet for some reason you are still here. This is where the observer's paradox changes everything. In standard physics, an event is absolute. It either happens or it doesn't. But quantum mechanics doesn't work like that. In a many-world scenario, every possible outcome occurs in some universe. This means that in some realities the gun fires and your life ends. But you will never experience those outcomes. You will only ever find yourself in the universes where you continue to exist. This is because death, in a personal sense, is something that can never be perceived. You don't see your own death, you only see the moments leading up to it. And if reality is constantly branching into infinite versions of itself, then your awareness will always end up in the paths where you survive. Think about it. Have you ever had a near-death experience? A moment where you were certain you were about to die, but somehow, against all odds, you survived? Maybe you just assumed it was luck, fate, or coincidence. But if quantum immortality is real, those moments weren't just lucky escapes. They were shifts. Moments where your consciousness continued in the reality where you lived, while another version of you in a parallel universe did not. From an external viewpoint, the people around you would see a world where you eventually do die. But from your own point of view, you will never reach that point. No matter what happens, your consciousness will persist. But if this is true, then what does it mean for the nature of reality itself? If we are always surviving in some universe, does that mean we are truly immortal? Or does it mean we are simply trapped in an infinite cycle of survival? Before we answer that, we need to confront an even bigger question. Can this theory actually be tested? And if so, why hasn't anyone successfully proven it? The quantum suicide thought experiment paints a fascinating yet disturbing picture. A world where your consciousness always follows the path of survival. But is this just a clever philosophical exercise? Or is there a way to actually test whether quantum immortality is real? Could a scientist, one willing to risk everything, actually prove that death is nothing more than an illusion? In theory, the quantum suicide experiment should provide a definitive answer to the question of whether the many worlds interpretation is correct. If a person continually survives what should be an impossible series of deadly events, this would suggest that their consciousness is indeed shifting between parallel universes, only experiencing the outcomes where they remain alive. But here lies the problem. While this experiment might prove quantum immortality to the person conducting it, it can never prove it to the outside world. A scientist attempting this experiment, from his perspective, he always experiences survival. He always wakes up in the universe where the gun jams. But for an external observer, the outcome is completely different. In most realities, the scientist dies. Their friends, family and colleagues mourn their loss, and the experiment appears to have simply resulted in another tragic death. There is no way for those in the outside world to confirm that in some branch of the multiverse the scientist is still alive, experiencing a reality where they continue to exist. The very nature of quantum immortality means that it can only be tested from a first-person perspective. And if you ever failed, well, you wouldn't be around to report the results. This is where critics of the quantum suicide experiment find their strongest argument. They claim that while the many worlds interpretation is a fascinating idea, there is no way to scientifically verify whether a person's consciousness actually shifts into surviving timelines. Some physicists believe that the brain, being a biological system composed of billions of neurons, may not function the same way as subatomic particles, meaning that quantum mechanics cannot apply to human consciousness in this way. Others argue that even if quantum immortality does exist, it may not protect against slow, gradual processes like aging or disease. But what if this experiment isn't just an abstract idea? What if quantum immortality is already happening, right now, in your own life? Have you ever faced a moment where you should have died but didn't? If so, is it possible that you have already experienced quantum immortality without even realizing it? To explore this question, we must take a step beyond theory and into something more personal, the strange and unsettling world of near-death experiences and reality shifts. Have you ever felt like reality shifts around you in subtle ways? Perhaps you've had moments where events unfolded in an almost impossibly precise sequence, like just barely avoiding a car accident or finding yourself in exactly the right place at the right time. What if these moments aren't just coincidences? What if your very act of observing reality is shaping the outcome? This idea isn't just science fiction. It's at the heart of one of the most baffling mysteries in quantum mechanics, the observer effect. At the quantum level, particles don't behave the way ordinary objects do. Instead of existing in one fixed place, they exist in multiple possible states simultaneously, a phenomenon known as superposition. But the moment someone observes a quantum particle, it instantly chooses one reality to exist in. Before observation, it exists in a cloud of probabilities. But once measured, it collapses into a single definite outcome. This isn't just a theoretical curiosity. It has been demonstrated in real experiments. One of the most famous is the double-slit experiment, where scientists fire tiny particles like electrons or photons at a barrier with two slits. If no one observes them, the particles behave like waves, passing through both slits at the same time and creating an interference pattern as if they existed in multiple places at once. But the moment scientists place a detector to observe which slit the particle goes through, something incredible happens. The wave-like behavior vanishes and the particle acts as if it only passed through one slit. Think about that for a second. The mere act of observing changed the outcome. It's as if reality itself waits to see if someone is watching before deciding what to be. Now let's take this one step further. If the act of observation determines the behavior of particles, then what happens when we scale this up to the level of human consciousness? Some physicists and philosophers have proposed a radical idea. What if your consciousness itself is a quantum process? If that were true, then your awareness could play an active role in determining which version of reality you experience. If your consciousness interacts with the quantum world in the same way that an observer in the double-slit experiment does, then in a scenario where multiple possible outcomes exist, like a life-threatening situation, your awareness may select the reality in which you continue to exist. In other words, quantum immortality may not just be about shifting between universes, it may be about the very nature of observation itself. You're not simply a passive traveler through time, you might be an active participant in shaping which version of events unfold. Could this explain why some people feel like they have narrowly escaped death in ways that seem statistically impossible? Could it be that they did, in fact, die in another version of reality, but their consciousness locked onto the one timeline where they survived? And if this is true, then what does it mean for our understanding of reality itself? Could the universe be structured in a way that ensures our survival? To answer that, we must explore something even deeper, the anthropic principle, which suggests that the very structure of the universe is fine-tuned for our existence. Let's dive into that in detail. Why are you here experiencing this reality in this exact moment? Out of all the possible versions of the universe, why do you find yourself in one where life is possible, where conditions are just right for you to exist? This is the question at the heart of the anthropic principle, a concept that suggests the universe must be structured in a way that allows for conscious beings like you to observe it. Otherwise, you simply wouldn't be here to ask the question. But What if this principle applies not just to the existence of the universe itself, but also to your own individual survival? What if, just as the universe seems fine-tuned for life, your own consciousness is only able to experience the versions of reality where you continue to exist? Scientists have long wondered why the fundamental laws of physics seem perfectly calibrated for life to exist. If the universe's fundamental constants, things like the strength of gravity, the charge of an electron, or the rate of cosmic expansion were even slightly different, life as we know it couldn't exist. Like if gravity were a little stronger, the universe would have collapsed in on itself. Or if it were a little weaker, galaxies and planets wouldn't have formed. Also, if nuclear forces inside atoms were just a fraction different, stars wouldn't burn and life would never have emerged. The odds of all these conditions aligning just right seem so astronomically small that some scientists believe this can't be a coincidence. Instead, they propose that there are infinite universes, each with different physical laws. We just happen to be in one that supports life, because it's the only kind of universe that conscious beings could observe. Now let's apply this same logic to your own survival. Just as the laws of physics must allow for life, the reality you experience must be one in which you continue to exist. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here to observe it. Let's return to the idea of quantum immortality. If every possible outcome of an event plays out in some universe, then there are always some versions of reality where you survive. And those are the only ones your consciousness can ever perceive. Think about the near-death experiences people report. Moments where they should have died, yet somehow didn't. Maybe they were in a terrible accident but walked away without a scratch. Maybe they were diagnosed with a fatal illness but miraculously recovered. To the outside world, this might seem like an incredible stroke of luck. But if quantum immortality is real, it's not luck at all. It's simply the fact that your consciousness only continues in the universes where you remain alive. In all the other realities, where the accident was fatal, where the illness took its course, where you didn't step away in time, you are no longer there to perceive what happens next. Those versions of you no longer exist in any way that matters to your conscious experience. You might have already died an unimaginable number of times, but each time your awareness seamlessly continues in the one version of reality where you survived. If this is true, then the universe you experience will always be one where you have continued to survive. But this raises a chilling possibility. Does this mean you can never truly die? If quantum immortality ensures that you always remain in the realities where you are still alive, then you might never reach a final death. No matter what happens, there will always be some version of reality where you persist. But the question is, what if this means you are doomed to survive forever, even in circumstances of unimaginable suffering? What if you eventually wake up in a reality where you are the last conscious being, trapped in an unrecognizable world, unable to escape? What if the anthropic principle applies not just to why you are alive now, but to why you will always be alive, no matter how much you wish to stop? Could quantum immortality be a gift, or is it a terrifying curse? To explore that, we need to ask a deeper question. If you are constantly shifting between realities, are you still the same person in each one? Or is every version of you a different entity entirely? Let's uncover that mystery. Waking up tomorrow and feeling different. You look in the mirror and something is subtly off. Maybe your memories don't quite line up. Maybe a small detail, your favorite childhood toy, the color of your first car, the lyrics to a song you swore you knew, feels strangely unfamiliar. You shake it off, dismiss it as a trick of the mind. But what if it's not? What if unknowingly you have already shifted into a different version of reality? What if the you that went to bed last night is not exactly the same you that woke up today? If quantum immortality is real, if every time you should have died, you simply transitioned into a reality where you survived, then we must confront an unsettling question. Are you the same person in every universe? Or is each version of you just a copy, believing itself to be the original? To answer this, we must first define what identity really is. What makes you you? Is it your memories, your body, your consciousness? Imagine you are teleported to Mars. Your entire body is deconstructed atom by atom and then reconstructed perfectly on the Martian surface. Every cell, every neural connection, every thought is exactly the same. But your original body on Earth is destroyed in the process. Are you still the same person? Or did the original you die, leaving behind only a perfect copy that believes it is the same? Now apply this to quantum immortality. Every time your consciousness shifts into a surviving version of reality, are you merely a copy of the previous you? Is the you from 5 minutes ago already gone, replaced by a slightly altered version of yourself who simply continues without realizing the transition? If so, then perhaps you don't exist as a single continuous being. Perhaps you are just the latest instance of an ever-changing consciousness, jumping from one timeline to another, always surviving, but never truly static. This dilemma is best illustrated by an ancient philosophical paradox known as the ship of Theseus. Imagine a wooden ship that has been kept in a harbour for centuries. Over time, the ship's planks start to rot and are gradually replaced with new wooden boards. One by one, every single part of the ship is replaced, until none of the original wood remains. Now here's the question. Is it still the same ship? Or is it an entirely different ship that just happens to carry the same name? Now think about yourself. Every cell in your body is constantly being replaced. Your thoughts, experiences, and even your personality evolve over time. And if quantum immortality is true, then your consciousness may be shifting through countless versions of reality, each one slightly different from the last. So, are you still you? Or are you just a continuation of something that only feels like a single, unbroken existence? If infinite versions of you exist across parallel universes, does that mean that none of them are truly you? Is identity just an illusion held together by memory and self-perception? If you met an alternate version of yourself from another timeline, someone who looks like you, thinks like you, and has lived an almost identical life, would that person be you? Or would they be a stranger who merely shares your past? Now take it a step further. Imagine that one of these versions has already died. If quantum immortality is real, then the only reason you are here is because your consciousness has continued in a timeline where you survived. But does that mean the you in the other universe who didn't make it was a different person? If every choice, every event, and every random quantum fluctuation creates a new timeline, then is your identity constantly changing as you shift realities? Or is there some deeper, unchanging core to your existence? This leads us to the final and most haunting question of all. Is there such a thing as a permanent self? If quantum immortality ensures that you are always experiencing survival, does that mean the version of you that dies is forever gone? Is the person you are today the same person you were yesterday? Or are you simply the latest iteration of an ever-changing entity, unaware that the you from a moment ago no longer exists? And if this is true, then what does it mean for death? If identity is fluid, If consciousness simply moves from one timeline to another, then perhaps death is not an end, but a transformation. But this raises an even more unsettling thought. If you're always surviving, does this mean that you are trapped in an infinite cycle of existence, never able to truly rest? You're driving down the highway, music playing softly in the background, your thoughts drifting. Then, in the blink of an eye, something goes terribly wrong. A truck swerves into your lane. You see headlights rushing toward you, feel the jolt of panic, brace for impact. And then, nothing. You're still driving. The road ahead is clear. The truck is nowhere to be seen. Your heart is racing, your hands are shaking, but everything around you looks normal. It's as if the accident never happened. But deep down, something feels different. A strange sensation lingers, like you just woke up in a reality where the crash didn't occur. This is the unsettling experience some people report after a near-death encounter. They vividly recall the moment they should have died, yet somehow, against all logic, they survived. Could it be that they didn't simply get lucky? Could it be that they actually died in another universe, but their consciousness shifted into a reality where they lived? This idea, one of the core implications of quantum immortality, suggests that every time you should have died, your awareness seamlessly continues in a universe where you survive. The other versions of you, the ones who didn't make it, still exist, but from your point of view, they might as well have disappeared. But how could we ever know if this was happening? How would it feel to jump between different realities without realizing? Some believe that the answer may lie in near-death experiences, profound, often mystical encounters that people report after coming dangerously close to death. For centuries, people who have come close to dying have described bizarre, almost dreamlike experiences. They report feeling suddenly disconnected from their body, a shift in their perception of time and space, a strange sense of waking up in a slightly different reality. Many who experience NDEs talk about a light at the end of a tunnel, an overwhelming sense of peace, or even seeing their life flash before their eyes. Some claim to have seen deceased loved ones or encountered beings of pure light, but others report something far stranger, a feeling that they have returned to life in a reality slightly different from the one they remember. One particularly eerie account comes from people who wake up after an accident or medical emergency feeling as though something has shifted, like reality is almost the same, but not quite. They recall details that don't match what others remember. They insist that certain objects, people, or even historical facts seem to have changed. Could this be a sign that their consciousness jumped into another universe? A world where they survived instead of dying? If quantum immortality is real, then every near-death experience is not just a brush with fate, but a transition to another timeline. Instead of experiencing an absolute end, a person would simply wake up in the version of reality where they continue to exist. But if we are constantly shifting between realities, wouldn't we notice? Wouldn't there be glitches, strange moments where the past doesn't quite align with the present? This brings us to an even weirder phenomenon, déjà vu and the Mandela Effect, potential clues that we may be jumping between different versions of reality all the time. Let's uncover that mystery next. You walked into a place you know you've never been before. Yet everything feels strangely familiar. Maybe it's a conversation where you already know what someone is about to say. Maybe it's a moment so vivid, so eerily recognizable that it leaves you with an unshakable feeling. I've been here before. I've lived this exact moment. This mysterious sensation is called déjà vu, a French term meaning already seen. Scientists have long debated its cause. Some believe it's a simple brain glitch where memories misfire and trick us into feeling like we've experienced something before. Others think it's a result of our brain processing information faster than we consciously realize. But what if déjà vu is something more? What if in that moment you're recalling something that actually did happen, just in a different timeline? If the many worlds interpretation is correct, then each choice you make, each event in your life creates a branching effect, splitting reality into multiple timelines. What if déjà vu is a moment where these realities briefly overlap? What if, for just a few seconds, your consciousness retains a faint memory of an alternate timeline, one where things happened almost the same way but not quite? Some people describe déjà vu experiences that go beyond simple familiarity. They claim to predict events just before they happen, only to be proven right seconds later. Could it be that they are remembering an alternate version of reality, one where they already lived that moment before shifting into this one? But déjà vu isn't the only strange memory phenomenon that hints at reality shifts. There's something even more unsettling, an experience shared by thousands, even millions of people worldwide. It's called the Mandela Effect, and it might just be the most compelling evidence that we have all been jumping between parallel universes without realizing it. The Mandela Effect gets its name from an odd historical discrepancy. Thousands of people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. A memory that does not align with recorded history, where Mandela was released and went on to become South Africa's president before passing away in 2013. But this is not an isolated case. People around the world report vivid memories of events, names, logos, and pop culture details that don't match our current reality. Here are some of the most famous Mandela Effect examples. The Berenstain Bears versus the Berenstain Bears. Many people remember this beloved children's book series being spelled Berenstain with an E, yet all records show it has always been spelled Berenstain with an A. Luke, I am your father. Many remember this iconic Star Wars line spoken by Darth Vader, but in reality the actual line is, "No, I am your father." The Monopoly man's missing monocle. Many recall the Monopoly mascot wearing a monocle, yet no version of the game has ever featured one. Mirror, mirror on the wall. In Snow White, many grew up hearing the line, "Mirror, mirror on the wall." But the actual movie quote says, "Magic mirror on the wall." Why do so many people share the same false memories? Could it simply be misremembering, or is it something far stranger? Some researchers believe the Mandela effect is caused by suggestibility and the way our brains reconstruct memories. Others argue that it could be linked to alternate timelines, meaning at some point these people did experience a different reality, one where these details were different. If we have been unconsciously shifting between parallel universes, could these discrepancies be the only clues left behind? Think about your own experiences. Have you ever encountered a moment where something felt off? A memory that doesn't match the reality everyone else remembers? A name, a logo, a historical event that you could swear was different? If quantum immortality is real, then your consciousness is constantly shifting into new versions of reality, universes where you survived when you shouldn't have. But what if, in the process, tiny details change? Could déjà vu and the Mandela effect be glimpses of the alternate timelines we've left behind? And if that's the case, then we must ask, have we already died without realizing it? If your awareness always follows the path of survival, then the you that existed in another timeline, the one that didn't make it, no longer exists in a way that you can perceive. But the real question is, if you have already died countless times but always wake up in a reality where you survived, is death even real? To explore that, we must confront the ultimate paradox. Can immortality ever become a curse? Now let's dive into that next. If quantum immortality means that every time you should have died, you instead continue in a universe where you survive, then does that mean you are truly immortal? Will you continue living forever, shifting from one reality to the next, never reaching an actual end? At first, this sounds like an incredible gift, the ability to never die, to always wake up in a universe where you live. But there's a problem. Near-death experiences, car crashes, fatal illnesses, these are sudden, life-threatening events. If quantum immortality applies, your consciousness simply continues in the reality where you escape them. But what about aging? What happens when your body begins to break down, when your mind starts to fade, when disease slowly eats away at you? If you always wake up in a timeline where you survive, does that mean you will one day exist as a mind trapped in a failing body, unable to die, yet unable to truly live? Most versions of quantum immortality focus on immediate binary survival scenarios, situations where you either die right now or continue living. But aging is different. It is not a single event. It is a gradual decline, a slow process that doesn't have an obvious survival branch. Some physicists argue that even if your consciousness is constantly shifting into surviving timelines, this doesn't mean you escape the natural effects of time. If your body grows old and weak, there may be fewer and fewer timelines left where you continue functioning. At some point, does your consciousness run out of new branches to jump into? Does quantum immortality eventually fail when there are no surviving versions of you left? Or does something even stranger happen? If every time you should have died, your awareness moves into a reality where you survive, then does that apply to aging itself? Could it be that your consciousness, rather than continuing indefinitely in an old, failing body, shifts into a younger version of yourself in another reality? Think about it. Have you ever experienced moments where your body suddenly felt healthier than expected? Have you ever looked in the mirror and thought, I should feel much older than I do? Could those moments be subtle shifts into timelines where you age more slowly? This idea, sometimes referred to as the quantum rebirth theory, suggests that your consciousness doesn't just move into parallel universes where you avoid death, but also into those where you remain younger, healthier, and more capable of surviving for longer. If true, then quantum immortality wouldn't just mean endless survival. It could mean eternal youth in some form. But if you always survive, always shift into a version of reality where you continue to exist, then we must ask a much darker question. What happens when survival becomes a curse? Because if you can never truly die, then does that mean you are destined to live forever, even when you no longer want to? Let's explore that terrifying possibility next. You wake up one morning looking into the mirror and seeing an unfamiliar face staring back at you. Wrinkles you don't remember. A body that feels heavier, slower. A mind that takes a second longer to recall a name, a memory, a thought. You've avoided death countless times, surviving car crashes, illnesses, near misses that seemed like miracles. But now you're facing something different. Not a sudden catastrophe. Not a split-second life or death decision. This time the enemy wasn't an accident. It isn't disease or violence. It's time itself. If quantum immortality ensures that your consciousness always shifts into a version of reality where you survive, then what happens when survival is no longer a matter of a single event, but a slow, inevitable decline? What happens when your body starts to fail, when your mind begins to fade, when the simple act of waking up each morning becomes a struggle? Does quantum immortality still work then, or does it have a limit? The theory of quantum immortality is simple when applied to sudden death scenarios, events where you either survive or die instantly. If every possible outcome exists in some parallel universe, then there will always be a timeline where you continue living. But aging isn't a single event. It's not a coin flip. It's not a moment of crisis where one version of you dies while the other survives. It's a process, one that slowly chips away at your body and mind, with no clear fork in the road, no obvious moment where survival splits into different timelines. So, what happens when quantum immortality collides with the slow, steady march of time? Could your consciousness still shift into a younger version of yourself in some other reality? If so, would you even notice? Imagine if, over the course of your life, every time you reached a point where your body should have become too weak, too fragile, your awareness slipped into a reality where you aged just a little bit more slowly. Would you suddenly realize you had been aging differently? Or would time seem to stretch endlessly, with no clear explanation for why you feel younger than you should? If this is true, then quantum immortality wouldn't just mean endless survival. It could mean something far stranger. It could mean that instead of ever truly growing old, your consciousness might always wake up in a universe where your body remains just healthy enough to keep going. But what if there's no escaping the aging process? What if, instead of shifting into a younger version of yourself, you're forced to continue existing indefinitely, even as your body and mind deteriorate beyond recognition? Would quantum immortality still seem like a gift? Or would it start to feel like a curse? Because if you are truly immortal, not in the way we dream of, but in the way quantum immortality suggests, then one day you may find yourself in a reality where everyone you have ever known is gone. A world where you have lived for so long that nothing familiar remains. A world where you are the last survivor of all existence, unable to die, unable to rest, forever trapped in an endless cycle of survival. Could quantum immortality lead to a fate worse than death? Now let's explore the dark side of immortality. At first, the idea of quantum immortality seems like an incredible gift. You never die. You always wake up. No matter what happens, your consciousness simply continues in a universe where you survived. But now, ask yourself, what happens after 100 years? 1,000? 1,000,000? What happens when the people you love are gone, when civilizations collapse, when even the stars in the sky begin to fade? If quantum immortality means you always survive, then does it also mean that you are doomed to exist forever? And if you can never die, does that mean one day you will wake up in a reality where you wish you could? Imagine standing in the middle of an empty city. The streets are silent, the buildings abandoned, the echoes of a civilization long gone. You don't know how long you've been here, decades, centuries, millennia. You remember living through wars, plagues, disasters. You remember surviving when others didn't. You remember feeling lucky time and time again. But now luck feels like a prison, because you're still here. And no matter how much you might want to rest, no matter how tired you become, no matter how much time passes, you always wake up. You've lived through every possible outcome, shifted through every possible version of reality. Yet in all of them, there is one common thread. You never reach the end. If quantum immortality ensures that your consciousness will always continue, then that means you are trapped in an endless cycle of existence. There will always be some version of reality where you are still alive, no matter how unbearable that existence becomes. Most people imagine immortality as eternal youth, a never-ending life of adventure, freedom and knowledge. But quantum immortality doesn't work that way. It doesn't prevent aging. It doesn't guarantee happiness. It only ensures that you will never experience the moment of death. So what happens when you're no longer the person you once were? What happens if you reach a point where your mind is fragmented, your body barely functions, and you're simply drifting through time, unable to escape? If you live long enough, you might end up in a reality where you are the last human left on Earth. You are trapped in a decaying, dying world with no escape. You have outlived not just your loved ones, but entire civilizations. You exist in a universe where all life has disappeared, except for you. Would you still want to wake up in the morning? Or would quantum immortality become a slow, inescapable nightmare? Some physicists speculate that in the far future, when all stars have burned out and the universe is a cold, lifeless void, there will still be one conscious being left: you. Because as long as quantum immortality holds true, there will always be a version of you that survives. Even as the universe itself collapses, even as all matter decays, even as time stretches toward infinity, there will be one last observer, one final mind, drifting alone in an endless, silent cosmos. Would that still be life? Would that still be you? Or would quantum immortality in the end be the most terrifying fate of all? Now let's step back and ask the ultimate question. Is quantum immortality a scientific reality, or just an illusion created by our own fear of death? Let's uncover the final truth in the next chapter. Take a deep breath, look around, feel the weight of existence pressing down on you for a moment. If quantum immortality is real, if every time you should have died, your consciousness simply continued in a universe where you survived, then what does that mean for your life? Does it change the way you see yourself? Does it change the way you see death? Imagine knowing with absolute certainty that no matter what happens, car crashes, accidents, fatal illnesses, there will always be some version of reality where you keep going. Would you live without fear? Would you take risks you never dared to take before? Would you chase every dream, knowing that failure might not matter in the grand scheme of infinite realities? Or would the opposite happen? Would life lose its urgency, its meaning? If you can never truly die, then does anything really matter? If you are destined to wake up again and again, no matter what, then does life lose the very thing that makes it precious, its fleeting, fragile nature? Some philosophers argue that the value of life comes from its impermanence. The fact that we only have a short time on this earth makes every moment meaningful. But if quantum immortality removes the possibility of a true ending, does that mean we are just characters trapped in an infinite story, endlessly moving from one page to the next, never reaching a final chapter? What would you do differently if you knew that you would never experience death firsthand? Would you live more fearlessly, or would existence become a weight, an endless cycle where survival becomes nothing more than routine? But there's another problem, one we cannot ignore to our home. We don't know for certain if quantum immortality is real. And until we find a way to prove it, we must ask, is this just an illusion? A story we tell ourselves to escape the fear of the unknown? Let's find out in the final section. For centuries, humanity has searched for proof of life after death. Some have turned to religion, others have looked to philosophy. But today, some are turning to quantum physics, searching for an answer buried deep within the fabric of reality itself. Could quantum immortality be the answer we've been looking for? Or is it simply an illusion, a comforting but unprovable theory that can never truly be tested? In science, for something to be considered real, it must be observable, measurable, and repeatable. We need evidence, proof that can be demonstrated again and again under controlled conditions. But here's the problem. Quantum immortality, by its very nature, can never be tested objectively. Why? Because it is a first-person experience. If quantum immortality is real, then the only person who could ever prove it is the person who survives. And even then, they would have no way to compare their experience to the alternate realities where they died. Take the quantum suicide experiment, for example. A scientist who runs the experiment would always wake up in the reality where the gun misfires. To them, it would seem like proof. But to everyone else, it would look like the scientist simply died in most realities, proving nothing. Even if we lived through multiple near-death experiences, always miraculously surviving, how could we ever prove that we had shifted into a reality where we continued to exist? We wouldn't have any memory of the versions of us that died. And those who remain in those timelines would simply experience a world where we are gone. Although we can't directly test quantum immortality, some physicists believe that the many worlds interpretation may eventually be provable. If we can demonstrate that parallel universes truly exist, then it would mean that multiple versions of reality, including versions where we died, must also exist. And if our consciousness is somehow tied to these branching realities, then quantum immortality could be a natural consequence of how the universe works. Some experiments in quantum mechanics, including attempts to detect quantum superposition at larger scales, could one day give us hints that reality is constantly splitting into parallel timelines. But even then, we may never know whether our awareness actually shifts between them. What if quantum immortality is simply a trick of perception, an illusion created by the fact that we are incapable of observing our own death? What if we are not actually surviving different versions of reality, but simply living in the one reality where we happen to be lucky? Or what if we're already shifting between realities all the time without even realizing it? If that's the case, then we must ask one final haunting question. Have we already died before, but just don't remember? Let's bring everything together in the final conclusion, but first let's see the criticisms. The idea of quantum immortality is fascinating. It offers a glimpse into a world where death is nothing more than an illusion, where our consciousness seamlessly continues into alternate realities, never reaching a final end. But not everyone is convinced. In fact, many scientists, philosophers and skeptics reject the idea entirely, arguing that it is nothing more than a misunderstood consequence of quantum physics, an interpretation taken too far. So before we draw any final conclusions, let's examine the biggest criticisms of quantum immortality and why many experts believe it's not as real as it seems. 1. The science problem. No evidence, no proof. The biggest challenge facing quantum immortality is simple. There is no scientific evidence that it happens. While the many worlds interpretation suggests that the universe splits into multiple versions of reality, there is no proof that a conscious mind can actually jump between them. Quantum mechanics applies to particles, not people. Just because electrons and photons exist in multiple states doesn't mean that human consciousness follows the same rules. And no known experiment can confirm quantum immortality. While physicists continue to study quantum mechanics, we have no way to test whether a person's awareness shifts into another reality upon death. Also, quantum suicide is impossible to verify. A scientist attempting this experiment would only ever experience survival, but to everyone else, they would appear to have died, making it scientifically unprovable. Without direct, repeatable evidence, most physicists consider quantum immortality to be more of a philosophical idea rather than a scientific reality. 2. The consciousness problem. Is awareness even quantum? Another major issue is the assumption that consciousness is linked to quantum mechanics. While quantum particles behave in strange and unpredictable ways, the human brain operates at a much larger, more complex level. Neuroscientists argue that consciousness is an emergent property of billions of neurons firing in the brain, not a quantum phenomenon. And there is no evidence that human awareness chooses a quantum state or collapses a wave function. Also, if consciousness is purely biological, then when the brain dies, awareness should end, just like any other physical process. This means that even if alternate universes exist, there is no reason to believe that a person's mind could transfer from one reality to another. Quantum mechanics governs particles, not the human soul. 3. The probability problem. Most universes are unlivable. Even if quantum immortality were real, it doesn't necessarily mean that survival would always be desirable. Critics argue that infinite survival does not guarantee infinite well-being. If your consciousness truly shifts into a universe where you avoid death, then over time you could find yourself in increasingly improbable and horrifying scenarios. For example, you might survive a fatal accident, but wake up in a reality where you are severely injured and unable to move. You might continue to exist in a world where everyone else has died, leaving you completely alone. You might one day find yourself in a version of reality where Earth has been destroyed and you are floating in space with no hope of rescue. Just because a version of you exists somewhere doesn't mean it will be a version of reality that you want to exist in. In other words, survival doesn't always mean happiness. If quantum immortality is real, then existence itself might become an inescapable nightmare, one where you can never truly find peace. 4. The psychological problem. Is quantum immortality just a comforting illusion? One of the strongest criticisms is that quantum immortality might just be a psychological coping mechanism, a way for people to deal with their fear of death. Throughout history, humans have created stories of immortality, whether through religion, reincarnation, or the idea of an afterlife. Could quantum immortality just be the modern scientific version of this age-old hope? It provides reassurance that death is not the end. It allows people to believe they will always wake up no matter what. It removes the fear of permanent non-existence. But just because something is comforting doesn't make it true. Skeptics argue that quantum immortality is nothing more than wishful thinking, a way for people to avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality that one day they will die, and there may be no coming back. 5. The death problem. Have you already died? Finally, there is one last criticism, one that might be the most unsettling of all. If quantum immortality is real, then that means you have already died many, many times. You just don't remember. Every near-death experience, every miraculous survival, every close call, those could have been moments where you actually died in another universe. But if that's true, then why don't we remember dying? Why don't we feel the transitions between realities? If quantum immortality works silently, shifting us between timelines without us realizing, then could it be that we are all living ghosts, moving between worlds, never realizing how many times we have already perished? Or is it just an illusion, a trick of quantum theory, misunderstood by those who desperately wish to believe in something greater than death? Let's bring everything together in the final conclusion. We started with a question, one that has haunted human beings for centuries. What happens when we die? Quantum immortality offers an answer unlike any other. It suggests that death is never truly experienced, that every time you should have died, your awareness simply shifts into a version of reality where you survived. If true, this would mean that you are already immortal, that you have already died many times without realizing it, that you are always waking up in a universe where you continue to exist on. But what does that truly mean? For some, quantum immortality is a comforting idea. It removes the fear of death. It means there will always be another chance. It suggests that consciousness is more than just biology. It is something that cannot be erased. But for others, it is a terrifying trap. If survival is guaranteed, does life lose its meaning? If you can never die, could you one day find yourself in a reality worse than death? If existence continues forever, will there come a time when you wish it wouldn't? Perhaps quantum immortality is not the dream we think it is. Perhaps rather than being a gift, it is an endless cycle, one from which there is no escape. At the end of the day, quantum immortality remains a theory, one that cannot be proven, one that exists at the very edges of science and philosophy. Some physicists argue that it is nothing more than a misinterpretation of quantum mechanics, an idea that sounds compelling but lacks any real evidence. Others believe that we may one day prove the existence of parallel universes, unlocking the true nature of reality and perhaps our place within it. But until then, we are left with only one thing: belief. Do you believe that quantum immortality is real? Do you believe that every time you should have died, you simply woke up in another version of reality? Do you believe that death is nothing more than an illusion, one you will never experience firsthand? Or do you believe that this is all just a comforting lie, an illusion created by our own minds, desperate to escape the one truth that no one can avoid? The choice is yours. As you finish watching this, take a moment to consider something. You are here. Out of all the infinite possibilities, all the possible timelines, you are alive, aware, experiencing this moment right now. Maybe it's just luck. Or maybe, just maybe, you are here because you have always been here. Because you have always survived. Because you always will. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If quantum immortality is real, what will you do with the infinite life ahead of you? The story is yours to continue.